Okay, this video is going to be about adding code to our program, right? So we have lots of things that we're going to need to do. First thing we want to make sure, of course, that we've imported our data. So I'm going to go to the Data tab. We're going to go to our data, which you can either search for, or this was under Science, Roller Coasters, and make sure it's imported. It should be in this little table over here. And I'm going to go back to code. And now, the first thing I want to do is create some variables to store the data from those data columns. So let's go back and look at the data briefly. What were some of the things we wanted to get from the data? Roller coaster name, amusement park, city, country, region. Now, by the way, if you want to change, you can change the name of these columns, but you can only do that in your version of the data set. So if you were trying to share this with someone else and they tried to import the data, it would have these old names and that program might not work for them. So I don't necessarily suggest changing them. So I'm going to leave them as are, but I'm going to want something for roller coaster name, amusement park, city, country, maybe not region. So let's add some code for that. So let's say var coaster name. So I prefer working in the text version. If you're using blocks, of course, you would just do variables, var x equals, right? But I'm going to call this coaster name. And what we're going to do is use get column. So this is under the data tab, get column. Oops, didn't like putting that in the front. Now, I do suggest, however, going back to block mode to select the things you want to get from get column. So we're going to choose the table, which we've imported, roller coasters. And then what column do I want? So I can see all the different column names in my data set. We want roller coaster name. Now, since I'm going to want to do this for a lot of different variables, I'm going to go back to text mode and I'm just going to use copy and paste. And I think, if I count this up, I think I needed like 8 of these for the amount of stuff I wanted in my program. Okay, so obviously we're going to need to change some of these. So we're going to have, this is coaster names. I like to do my lists as plural. Instead of coaster name, we have what? Park names, cities, countries. What else do we need in there? We needed the heights, speeds. These are all things that I want for my program. Lengths, and then number of inversions. Okay, so obviously I don't want to get the roller coaster name and store them in all these different variables. And these are all global variables. Remember, global variables are defined outside of any function, meaning I can call these in any function I define and redefine them or use their values, etc. So let's change this to park names or amusement park, cities to city, countries. We want the column of country stored in that, heights, that's height, speeds, speed, lengths as length. And be careful on this next one. There's inversion and number of inversions. This inversion, if I remember looking at the table, just said yes or no, whether it had inversions. We'll do number of inversions. Okay, so that should get all my data. We can check one of those by adding them to our watcher. This is a nice thing to do. Say park names, right? Click enter, it's undefined, but when I run my program, it's got the 257 items of all these park names. So it looks like that's working. We'll get rid of that, and great. Let's stop our program. So far so good. We've got our data imported and stored in some variables. Some of the first things I'd like to do to this, now that we've got our data, is add the functionality of our buttons to navigate to one page to the other. Okay, and those are under user interface controls. That's what user UI stands for, user interface. And these are on events. Okay, so on event, and we'll go back to blocks for this. So when the user clicks, this was called the least button. Least button. When the action of the user has clicked it, that's what I want by default here. Well, what do I want it to do when they click this least button? I want it to take them to the least screen. So to change screens, that's called set screen. And that's down here at the bottom under UI controls, set screen. And what screen do I want them to change it to? The least screen. Okay, so now I know I want this functionality to be very similar for the greatest button. So I'm going to change this here. Just copy and paste real quick using text mode. When they click the greatest button is clicked, I want it to set the screen of the greatest screen. So let's see if those work. If I click least, boom, it has changed me. My home button doesn't work yet. That's okay. Let's run our program again. And greatest, oops, I haven't changed I didn't change my text up there in my design, did I? Let's go and fix that. Greatest. Oh, I did. It's just off. It was too much text. Okay, so we'll fix our design. There we go. Now I'm for sure on the greatest screen. Okay, so those two work. That's nice. We're going to want to do a couple more of these to bring us back to the home screen from the least screen and greatest screen. So I'm just going to copy and paste. Let's instead, when they click the greatest home screen buttons, this is when you're on the greatest and I want to go home, take me back to the home screen. And when they click the least home screen button is clicked, take me back to the home screen. Okay, so I think this should have all of our navigation working correctly. Let's run this. Least takes me to the least screen, home brings me back home, greatest back here, and home back home. Perfect. All my buttons work. The only other input by the user here is our drop downs, right? I want when the user changes one of these or selects one of these for it to tell it which one is the least tall, right? Or one with the least height roller coaster in my data set. I realize, by the way, this is not a real roller coaster, but it looks cool, so we're keeping it. So let's go ahead and add in some functionality here for our drop downs. So this is also an event on event, but this time the event that's happening is, let's say when I'm on the least screen, the least drop down, not is clicked. I don't want it to run this function anytime it's clicked. I want it to run when the function has been changed. So not when the user first clicks on this, but when they've selected something that's different, right? So maybe height was already displayed to them. I don't want it to run anything yet until they've clicked speed and now it's changed. So least dropdown is changed. I'm going to want that to do some stuff. And very similar, I'm going to want one, right, for greatest dropdown. When that is changed, I want that to help me find some of that stuff as well. So these are some of the functions I'm going to need. Let's call these our button events, drop down events. We'll come back and add a little bit better commentary to these. This is our data set variables. Okay, so we might need some global variables we'll add in here in a minute, etc. Okay, so let's see, what do I want to happen? Well, when they change something in the least dropdown, I want it to find the least height. So we're going to need a function. So let's define a new function. You can do this under variables, or sorry, functions, function my function. Or if you're typing it in, you just type function. So I'll type it in. The name of your function, let's call this find least. Open, close parentheses, and then open and close curly brackets. Okay, you can get all of that by just dragging in this like function, my function, and just rename it here. Okay, up to you. So find least, what do I want this to do? So let's give it some commentary. I want it to get the text from the least dropdown, right? I want it to read what this is. Reduce the, well, depending if it's height, etc., right? We have these different things up top, right? Like height, speed, lengths, etc. So get the text, reduce the appropriate list, to the smallest measurement. and then display the coaster name, park, city, country, the stat itself, right? Like how many meters tall or how fast it was, and maybe the units it was measured in, either meters or kilometers per hour, I think, for ours, or inversions. Okay, so first thing I need to do is get the text from the least dropdown. So how do I do that? Let's go to the least screen. So here's my dropdown. To get the text, we actually use get text. So it's under UI control, get text. And what do we want to get the text from? This is the least dropdown. And you can select that in block mode. Right, you could do just select least dropdown. Right, and this is why meaningful names make your life a lot easier. Okay, so get the text from the least dropdown, but I need that to be stored somewhere, right? So I can compare it. So let's create a local variable. So this variable will only exist inside of my least function. So let's call it selection. Okay, so I have this new variable selection that's going to store whatever the user got. So for instance, if they selected height, it should store height. Okay, so here, let's say when they change the least dropdown, call my function. I need to make sure this is going to be executed to check if this is working. So when they change the least dropdown, call this function. So now we have the var selection, get this. Now let's say if the selection double equals, remember is a comparative statement. If it equals, well, what are some of the things in here? Height, speed, or length, and they do need to be capitalization, spelling needs to match. So height, what do I want it to do if it's height? Well, I want the list I'm going to reduce. So in fact, let's create a local variable called list to reduce. And that's going to be a list or an array. So I'm just going to create an empty array to start. And if it's height, let's set that list to be a copy of the heights list. And that's our global list, right, that we got from our column, and it stored all of those 257 heights. So this is just going to be a copy, but now stored in one variable. Now the reason I'm doing that, because if, very similarly, in fact, let's do some copy and paste here. Let's go to a new line, paste, paste. Oops, go to a line break there. So let's say if the selection is speed, the list I want to reduce will be a copy of speeds. And if it's length, I want it to be the lengths list instead. So now I'm saying no matter what it is, put the correct values in this list called list to reduce. Okay. And we're going to do that because I think we're going to use a for loop, right? So we can go to control. Here's our for loop, if you forget the syntax for a for loop. So var I equals 0, I is less than. Now this is how we tell it how many times we want it to run. So I want it to run the number of data pieces we have in here, right? So if I add this in, it's my watchers. I can see there's 250 pieces of data. So could I write less than 257 or equal to 257? Yes, but if this data set gets updated and there's more coasters, it's going to be missing some info. So the better way to do this is to take something that has your data in it, like coaster names. Really could be any of these pieces of data, right? Any of these columns all have the same number of data or elements. And we're going to say dot length. Okay, so it's always I is less than your array dot length. And then if that's true, increment I by 1. Okay, so this will go through our loop for every single element. Well, what do I want to happen in here? I want to find the smallest value. So we're going to have some sort of if statement. If, now remember, everything that we're going to be comparing here is now in this variable called list to reduce. So if list to reduce item I, that's the current one we're looking at as we iterate through our list. if that value is smaller than, so less than, or equal to the current, let's say, minimum value. So I don't have a variable yet called minimum, but we're going to create one. So if it's less than or equal to the current minimum value, well, what do I want it to do? I want it to replace our stored minimum value with this new value, right? So if the piece we're looking at is smaller than the one we have stored as our current smallest value, replace our smallest stored value with that new value. Okay. So where is min? We haven't described it. So let's create one, a variable called min. And now I could assume maybe the minimum value, I could hard code some number in here. That's not a great idea. What we always want to do when you do a reduction like this is assume that the very first element is possibly the smallest. So that would be, remember, at index 0 for JavaScript. So we're going to assume that the minimum value is the first item in our list. It's now list to reduce, right? Which is either the length, speeds, or heights, depending on what they've done. So we start with that. We come through here. It says if the first value we look at, which is actually index 0, is less than or equal to the min, in this case it would be equal because they're the same value, then I want it to replace it. And that's fine. That doesn't change anything for the first time. But what's important here is not only do I want to replace my minimum value, when it finds the minimum value, I want to get the park name, right? I want to get like the city and all those things that it's being used in. So let's create some other variables that we're going to need here as well, like variable park name, variable city. And I'm just making these empty strings so it knows what data type they are. You don't necessarily have to do this part. Var city, var country. There's coaster name, right? Var coaster name. What else did we want to display? Maybe units. Ooh, actually, depending on what they've selected here, the units are different, right? Heights and lengths were measured in meters, but speed is kilometers. So maybe let's make the units variable up here. And then let's change its value really quickly, depending on what the user selects. If it's heights, let's make the units in meters. If it's speed, let's make that kilometers per hour. And if they choose length, my units was in meters or meters. Okay. So we've already now created units and set it depending on their selection. So we got the park name, coaster name, city, country. We've got the minimum value. We've got our units. I think that's everything I wanted to display, right? We kind of check coaster name, park name, city, country. Yeah, I think everything we've got stored. Okay, so what I want to do when it does find a newest small value is, let's update the coaster name with not list to reduce I, but coaster names I. So that might seem confusing. Come back up here. Remember coaster names, we grabbed all of the roller coasters names from our data set. And this might make more sense, right? So let's go to the data and take a look at an example. So let's say we're looking at this particular one, right? Montana, Rusa, and Ventil. Okay, so let's say maybe it had the least height. It was the shortest of all of them, right? So it had the smallest height. Well, when I look at this one, if I say, hey, this is the new minimum, it's at the same position or stored in the same position in my list, right? As this coaster name, the amusement park name, they're all at the same position in each of those lists we stored in our code, right? So at the very first index, which is actually index 0 here, would have that same coaster name, park name, city, and our smallest height we found. So what we're saying here is at this position, if that's our newest small value, let's store that corresponding coaster's name, right, in coaster name. That's my new local variable we just described here, right? fact, I think we want to get all of these things. So I guess I just need to get these ones. So I want the park name, oops, not spaced out very great. So fix that, park name equals park names. So remember, again, I always like to make my lists or arrays plural, so it's easy to remember how I name them. City is cities at position I, and country was countries. And again, you can double check what you named these above, back up in your data sets, right? Countries, cities, park names, coaster names, etc. Okay, so store the corresponding one that has our new lowest value. So let's run this, right? I've just done a ton of coding here. So let's say I pick height, right? Let's add a watcher in to see what the coaster name is. So it's not available. I don't think it likes these local variables. So unfortunately, it's not going to let me check that part. But I could make these global variables and we can check them. In fact, because these don't have to be, well, these ones don't have to be local. You can put these global and check it. I think we're doing okay. So I'm just going to move on for now. Okay, so if we've coded this right, this should go through and find all of our stuff. So I'm going to add some commentary here. List to traverse and reduce to the least chosen stat stored in list to reduce. Right, and this first part, maybe I'll put this a variable lower, just to make a little more sense to put this right near my for loop. And this is assume smallest value is the first item in a list or array. Okay. And these are local variables for text display. All right. So don't worry, I know we still have to do one for the greatest, but we're going to be able to copy and paste a lot of this code. So now what we need to do is add in some text, right? We want to display some text here. So let's create a string, our output string. And what do I want it to say? I think I want it to start with the coaster's name, right? Coaster name. So what would we store that in? We stored that in coaster name, the variable coaster name. But I'm going to want to concatenate or add some stuff onto this string. So I want a space, so that the word in is not jammed all the way up against my coaster name. I think it was in park name. So we're going to concatenate with the variable park name. So I'm double clicking here and using copy and paste to make this a lot easier. Plus, once again, what do I have here? In park name, city, country. So let's just do park name, space, city. I think I want maybe like a comma and a space before the country. Right, again, these are the ones we've stored here. What else do I want in there? Has the greatest, or in this case, least, right, from our least screen. Has the least. And then I'm just going to go to a new line here. Press plus, go to a new line. That's okay, I can continue my string here. It'll make it a little easier to read. In fact, maybe we'll do that here. Has the least. And then this was the selection, right? So least height or speed or length. I can use the user selection here. And we can say at, and then let's do min should have our lowest value. And then we're going to want to display space and maybe the units we have stored, and then maybe a period at the end. So this is a big long string here. It's got a lot of stuff in it. Let's put the text in this field by using set text. And the field we want to put it into for this one is going to be the least text output. Okay, so that's a lot of coding. Let's check it. How did we do? Height? Oh no. Set text parameter. Oh, we forgot to tell it what text, right? This is the bad side of using typing. So what text do I want to put in that text field? Our newly created output string. Let's try again. Hey, I like this. Okay, Monterante Infantil. That's the least height at 3 meters. Oh wow, that really was the least. What about the least speed? 9.72 kilometers per hour. Length looks pretty good. The only thing I don't like, maybe I'll make this text bigger, that's not an issue, but the word length, right, it's matching these, has that capital letter, which kind of looks weird to me in the middle of a sentence. There is a nice way to deal with that. So we're getting this word from the user's selection, right? It's stored in selection. So any variable that has a string, you can do this operation to. So at the end of the variable, you can put dot to lowercase. And this is actually a function that you can call on a string. So this is kind of weird. You haven't learned how to do this yet, but what this is going to do is take all of the characters in the text string selection and put them all lowercase. So anyway, there's an extra thing maybe we didn't know how to do. Let's try this. And now when it says speed, notice my S there is lowercase. So that's great. Okay. So here's the nice thing. We just did this all for find least, right? That's a lot of code in find least. We're going to want to do this for find the greatest. So what we can do though, is a lot of this code is going to be the same. So do a little copy paste. So instead of find least, let's create one for find greatest. So find greatest. Let's make sure this is called when the greatest dropdown is changed. Call this function. Okay, so now we're in find greatest function. So all of these things are the same. We did have under the greatest, there was one more of these, which was number of inversions. Make sure again your capitalization, everything matches exactly the menu. So just to show that, when I go to greatest, right, number of inversions. The length here, where the list was called number of inversions, and the units is just inversions. Okay, I still want to have these local variables to store the names, but instead of min, notice by the way, when I double click this, there's 4 places where it says min. I'm just going to change this to max. I want to make sure I change it into 4 places. Code.org is going a little slow for me here. Max, max, and max. Okay, so I think that's okay. Now, I do need to change what we're filtering. So we want to assume that the largest value is the first in the list. This is going to find the greatest chosen stat. But instead of if the item is less than or equal to max, I only want to change it if it's greater than or equal to max, update the new max, get the coaster name, etc. And where I want this string to be output, it's not the least text output, but the greatest text output. So notice I didn't have to change a whole lot for this second function. So I'm going to hit reset. Let's see if this is working. Height. That's the least, select a statistic. Uh-oh. Oh, here we go. Find the greatest. The selection is looking for the least dropdown instead of the greatest dropdown. So let's try that. Here we go. It's the least speed. Oh, it still says least in my text. Not least speed, because that's pretty fast. That's definitely the here we go, has the greatest speeds. This is some small troubleshooting when you use this copy and paste method, but has the greatest length, has the greatest number of inversions. I guess this coaster doesn't have a name, but this is pretty good. I need to add in some commentary, but my program is now working. Right? Okay, one last thing to denote here. There is one place where we can run into an error with the program. So let's say the user goes to the least screen and they pick height, right? It finds the ride with the least height. All of that looks great. I still need to make my text bigger, but otherwise it's fine. However, if the user goes back and clicks select a statistic, notice it's picked one, I think this is like the last item in our list, has the least select a statistic at undefined. Okay, so this is like a logic error, right? This is something, I haven't gotten like an actual error in my program, but it's not working as intended. So I still like to have this in my list, so I don't have to have a separate label. So here's a way that we can work around that. So let's say in my find least, when we go to get our selection, right? So we've gotten the text from our dropdown. Here's one way we can do that around it. We can say if selection is equal to select a statistic, exactly as it is, statistic, in our menu here. Okay, if it's that option, I basically want it to stop. Don't do anything else. Don't update the screen. Don't go through the rest of this function. And we haven't learned this yet, but one of the things you can do to exit a function, just tell it like, hey, if this is true, just stop. Don't do anything else. Just exit the function, is we use what's called return. So this is one way I can program it. Say, hey, if they select this, then just exit the whole function. Don't do anything else. Just leave it. Whatever was there is done, and the rest of the function is not returned. Okay. If you don't like that option, another way that you can program this, and just to show you that it works, when they select speed, right, Gemini, when I go back and select this now, nothing has changed, right? Perfect, that's what I wanted, is return and exit the function. Another way you can do this is say, if it doesn't equal select a statistic, then run everything else in our code. The only reason I don't like this option is I have to put in this extra close bracket, and then everything else in here needs to be indented in one more because we're inside this giant if statement. So if this is not true, then run the rest of the code until the end of the function. I just think having that indented all the way in looks a lot uglier, and it's nice to have that return function. So I might do that same thing, of course, for find least and find greatest. I'm going to use the return option here, but that's a new thing. If you want to tell it to exit a function that you're working in, you just write return. So this should now fix the minor logic error that we had in our program. Right? So make sure you have good commentary on all these functions, what they're doing, what each part of them are doing, so it's easy to read. Hopefully this gave you some ideas of what you can do and how copy and paste for similar things makes your life a lot easier.